So, welcome to VuFind Summit 2017. I just wanted to open up with sort of state of the project and some ideas for things we can talk about the next couple of days. In order to do this, I went back to my slides from last year and more or less copied them. So, I'm actually really happy with how the process went last year. I think we talked about some good things, we made some decisions, we've spent the last year acting on those decisions and making real progress. So when I reviewed the slides, there were a bunch of things where I thought, oh, we did that, cross it off, we did that, cross it off. But there were also some things that we brought up that we didn't act on because they weren't our priorities. So I'm going to just bring them up again. Maybe they're priorities now, maybe not, but I think it's helpful to just sort of refresh and review. But before we get to that stuff, let's talk about what we have accomplished since last time. We've got two new releases, 4.0 and 4.1. 4.0 took a while to get to and came out a little later in the year, but then 4.1 followed hot on its heels and added more features than I would have thought we could get crammed in there in just 3 months. So I'm quite happy with where we ended up. So what's in those releases? We updated a number of dependencies. We got up to Solar 6.4.2. We switched from the monolithic Zend framework to the Zend framework components and got a lot of those up to the latest versions, though not yet all of them. And we've got some cool new features. We've got a new modern-looking theme called Sandal. Thank you, Chris. And there's still work to be done on that, but we've got a really good start. We've got the channeled content interface that was, I think, a big hit when it was demonstrated last year. It's now released and working, though I think we have more work to do developing it once we actually start using it in production, but we're at that point at least. We've got formal VuFind APIs at last for performing searches and reading records. Thank you, Array, for that, which would not have happened without you. Also from Array, we've got a built-in internationalization-aware static page mechanism, so you can put in translatable pages into your custom site if you need those. And finally, we've got Browsine support. Browsine is a commercial service for searching for journals. And by supporting their API, we have the ability to add a journal title search to our bento box, which is something that's been high in demand here at Villanova, and perhaps others will find that useful as well. And I've been very impressed with the company Third Iron that produces this product in terms of how helpful they've been in developing this and providing APIs. So that's an unsolicited plug there. On the front of major improvements to the software, we've integrated the whoops error handler, which has become kind of a standard across many PHP projects. So when you're in development mode and a fatal exception occurs, you get thrown into whoops, which shows you the full backtrace of the error, and you can click on steps in the backtrace and it actually shows you the code in another part of the window. It's really handy for debugging. We've got a new permission handling configuration that's been in development for well over a year and finally got merged, which allows you to configure how VuFind responds when permissions are denied, both at the controller level and at the template level. So you can say, you know, if somebody tries to access this controller action that they're not allowed to access, do we throw an exception? Do we redirect them to a particular page? Do we show them a flash message? Or if there's a control on the page that the user's not allowed to see, do we display an alternate template, suppress it completely, etc.? So I don't know how heavily this will get used, but it gives us some more flexibility that we didn't have before. We've also done some work on themes. There's been a demand for creating distributable modules that could plug into VuFind, but stand alone. So somebody could maintain a project that adds some feature to VuFind, but isn't merged into VuFind by default. And one of the main limitations preventing us from doing that was the fact that most new features require templates, and VuFind didn't have a way to load templates from somewhere outside of its themes. So we added this mix-in idea where we've always had an inheritance hierarchy of themes, but now you can say, as part of a theme, mix in these other folders, And VuFind will search not just the theme folder, but also all of the mix-ins, which lets you just drop in functionality by compositing multiple things together. And because if you had a really complicated hierarchy of themes with many mix-ins, searching for the templates to display would get inefficient and ugly, we built a theme compiler that will take your entire hierarchy of themes and mix-ins and compile them into a flat theme that has all of the files that could possibly be needed to speed up performance. I honestly don't have any evidence that it's so slow that the theme compiler is necessary, but it just felt right. And finally, we've got some expanded ILS support, the Sierra REST ILS driver for utilizing the RESTful APIs of Sierra. There's also been some ongoing work with the Koha drivers, and there's more of that to come. So, having accomplished all that, what's next for the next year? And I think for us, one of the top priorities is focusing on next generation ILS support, or as some would argue, current generation ILS support, since the next generation stuff has been around for a while now. But I feel one of the problems we've had in the community the last few years is that we've lost some members because they moved to systems that were not supported by VuFind and they didn't have the time or resources to add support. So to that end, I think we want to try to make sure that VuFind continues to interoperate with all of the most popular ILS packages, which not only will help strengthen the community, but will also give all of us more options as we evaluate our own library systems moving forward. We also need to continue to stay on top of dependencies because dependencies are the new endless problem that we all face. If things would just stop changing, we would have so much less work to do. Continue to look at ways in which we can restructure the project to make things work better and be easier to work with. And finally, continue discussions about the project itself. Where does it live? What does it do? How is it managed? We've gotten by many years as an extremely ad hoc community, and that has worked well for us. But I do see the number of people in this room is smaller than it has been in the past, and I just want to be sure that we don't lose any of what we have through lack of oversight or pre-planning. So a conversation to keep having. So to dig a little deeper into all of that, let's talk about ILS support. Earlier in the year, Chris began work on a proof of concept Alma driver, which is now available as pull request number 955. We now have partnered with a library in Germany to actually test this against a real deployed Alma instance. So I'm very optimistic that we will have a working Alma driver in VuFind 5.0, which is something that I know a number of people have been watching for. And then there's Folio, which is a new open source project that a lot of people are watching. And EBSCO was kind enough to give us a Folio innovation grant to fund development of a VuFind driver for Folio. And we are committed to produce something by June of 2018. So again, I hope that means that something Folio related will go into VuFind 5.0. But of course I have to add the cautionary note that Folio is still being developed. As of right now, all the functionality we need to integrate with doesn't even exist yet. So we clearly can't meet that target if the underlying software doesn't do what we need it to do. But we at least promise that we'll have an update for you by June saying where we are. And if things go well, we might have a whole working driver. And finally, another system that's not currently supported out of the box is OCLC's World Share Management System. And there is some work in progress on that in pull request number 218. You'll notice from that low number that that's been open a really long time. But we did get some contribution from OCLC to do some development around WorldCat Discovery and WMS. It's really almost done, but it never got finished, and it's now out of date and needs to be merged up to date. So I'm hoping that at some point we can go the last mile and get that stuff done. And if anyone's a WMS or Discovery user who needs this, talk to me and we can make that happen. On the subject of dependencies, Zen Framework 3 is something we've been talking about for a while. And as I said, we are now using some Zen Framework 3 components and some Zen Framework 2 components because where Zen Framework used to be a giant monolith, it's now a bunch of interoperating components, which I think is a step in the right direction because it allows us to not include a lot of code that we never use. But some of the Zen Framework 3 components are bigger changes than others and take more work to upgrade. And the next really big obstacle is getting to the version 3 service manager. If you've worked with VuFind's architecture at all, you know that Zen Framework service managers and service locators are a really fundamental part of how VuFind works and how it manages its plugins. And they've changed things significantly. And all the changes make sense, but they will break things and it will take a while to get those breaks fixed. So I'm hoping to devote some time to this. I think it may be one of my priorities over the coming year, but there may be more urgent priorities as well. We'll talk about this when we begin road mapping. Also of note is the fact that some of the Zen Framework 3 components are starting to require PHP 7.1. Right now, the project requires PHP 5.6, and that's another thing I want to definitely talk about during road mapping. You know, what should our target PHP version be? I would love to get to some flavor of 7 because it has cool features and it's really fast. And a lot of us are running it anyway. But again, how do we get there without inconveniencing anyone too much? Also, Solar 7 is out. And Solar is another whole area of this project where we've been upgrading it, but we haven't been able to take the time to really reflect on what new things the package can do. And with Solar 7, they're apparently releasing a whole new API into Solar that changes everything. So we need to look at that. We need to think about costs and benefits, etc. Certainly the last few Solar releases, I think last year I was very happy with our Solar upgrade because they had finally fixed some open bug that had been bothering me for literally years, and it was fixed. And that's great. But the last couple of releases, the main thing that I'm aware of is that it doesn't perform as well as it used to. So we need to think about when to jump in on upgrades and what we can perhaps do to make the most of Solar. More discussions. So project restructuring. This is the part where a lot of these things are still hanging around from last year and may not need to be changed right away, but they're things we could do. Do we want to refactor our configuration files, which have been growing for a decade now and could probably be organized better? Might be good, would be disruptive. Do we want to clean up the ILS driver interface? Again, it's been organically growing for a decade. We could probably make it better, but it's hard to test those things when you change them. It's disruptive. Do we revisit the way that searches are controlled by options, parameters, and results classes? The thing I've been grumbling about since I refactored it that way many years ago? Maybe I'm getting used to it. Do we refine the record driver hierarchy? This is one that I personally think is a good candidate for refactoring in 5.0 because I have a strong idea of how I'd like to rearrange the way the record driver classes inherit from each other and use some traits to better share logic. But maybe nobody else thinks that's a good idea. We'll talk about it. Reorganize language files. We made a lot of progress on that this year. Thank you, Chris, for tokenizing strings that needed tokens and didn't have them. I think we're getting closer to a point where we might be able to use something like Translate Wiki to help with our translations, but there's still some room for a little more refactoring there. So again, something we can talk about. Can we do more with the new permission system? It now has more features. How should we use them? And my favorite, again, perpetual thing, right now our controllers have a lot of logic in them. Can we refactor them, make them lighter, make them cleaner? And I think that piece ties in very nicely with upgrading to the new service manager from Zen Framework 3, because I think doing one is going to force the other, or vice versa. Code quality. Again, this is exactly the same as what I said last year, but I'll repeat it. Do we want to try to up our test coverage? Do we want to try to reduce our PHP mess detector warnings? Can we measure JavaScript quality better? I think we've made some improvements in that area. And finally, should we begin measuring the indexing code quality written in Java now that all that Java code lives primarily in the VuFind repository? It would probably be a good idea to be measuring it in some way, making sure it's style compliant and whatnot. That's just a matter of picking the standards and adding tools to check them. And then onward to the discussions about an institutional home. So, as I said last year, Villanova continues to support VuFind. I have no concerns about that stopping. But at the same time, a project that is used by so many people and depended on by many, living in a single institution without its own formal budget, seems potentially fragile in the long term. So we've been in discussions with different organizations about the possibility of homing it with a nonprofit so that it has a little bit more independence. It could perhaps receive financial support in a different manner, etc. We ruled out a couple of options. We're in discussion with one possible home that seems promising. So promising, in fact, that Chris and I were at a conference last week and it was announced that we had partnered with them even though we haven't. So I don't know how that happened. But anyway, don't believe the rumors yet, but maybe we'll have something to say soon. But anyway, I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts on this if they have experience with moving an open source project or thoughts on a model that would be more useful than what we currently have. Speaking of that conference from last week, it was an open source sustainability conference, and certainly in talking with people from other projects, it highlighted the fact that everybody else is farther along than we are in terms of formalization of organization. As I say, we're currently very ad hoc, and that's been great so far, but thinking of long-term sustainability, we should have a community conversation about whether there are things we should be doing better to keep this thing going. And that is really all of my food for thought. So if anybody wants to ask questions or have a little conversation now, let me see. I got through that pretty fast. When does this slot end on the schedule, Chris?
10:15.
Okay, yeah, we've got half an hour. So we can either talk for a while or we can jump ahead of schedule and get Chris up here. And anyone online, feel free to unmute and say something.
I could say something about solar.
Please do.
I've been sort of working with the performance issues and trying to find out and understand what's going on really. And so far, the situation with newer solar versions that don't perform as well as the older ones is that all the changes make sense, but then they have sort of removed some older ways of doing things that work for our situation. The way that the facets, for example, in VuFind work, and how the values are defined, the cardinality of everything, and so on. So, for example, the old way of faceting that's not really properly available anymore is slow to start up, but pretty fast when you have it running. While the newer way of using the doc values and everything works really well with continuously updated indexes that need to incorporate new changes all the time, and those are way faster to warm up, but then they don't perform as well in our case, and that's kind of a tricky thing to do properly, because it seems that from what I've been testing that some of the facets where the cardinality is high would actually benefit from doc values while some don't. And currently it's not possible to have to select the method used for our field where the doc values are enabled. So I suppose that's my primary gripe at the moment, that you can't have doc values and the old method for faceting at the same time.
So
I don't know if that makes sense, but that's actually a hairy situation.
Yeah, so this goes back to our earlier conversations about whether or not to include doc values in the schema by default and what that actually means and what the implications are, which has always been murky at best.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that most people are like, yeah, doc values are the best thing, and you should just use them without realizing any of the downsides that they have. So there has been some discussion, and now the good thing is that also some of the Solar developers have realized the situation that it's not perfect for everyone, and you can't just go on and say that use doc values and it'll be fine. But it's still not possible to really select what you're using without changing the index definition.
So perhaps we will get some new API parameters in the future that will help with this, maybe.
I hope so, and that may be something that I'm going to see if I can do something about it at some point of the future. So.
And of course the challenge now is which API, since perhaps, if I'm counting correctly, there are 3 possibilities now, being the version 1 Facet API, the version 1 JSON Facet API, and now the version 2 API, which I know nothing about as yet.
Yeah, me neither. But from what I looked at previously was that JSON Facet, it's sort of like in a similar situation to doc values, that everyone says that they are good and you should use them. But then when you try to use them, there are actually things that you cannot do with them yet. So it's again one difficult thing to do. So I tried to change some of I just tried to turn one of the usual queries we have into JSON facets, and it was possible, but the resulting query was really slow. So I'm not sure if it's there yet.
Well, if nothing else, we may want to start a Solar 7 branch just to begin experimenting. Something for my to-do list and for the dev call.
That's probably a good idea. And then at the same time, every release has quite a few nice fixes and improvements in other places. So that's why we have been trying to keep up, especially with the cloud functionalities. It's almost mandatory to update every time because there's always some rave bug that you need to get rid of.
Right. And certainly, as I say, one of my regrets is that I never have time to go back and look at all the new features and decide what might be a beneficial addition to VuFind. But I welcome that as a contribution anyone could make if they have time and inclination.